Elias Thorne was like a treasure hunter lost among the dusty shelves. In the dim light of antique shops, he studied yellowed parchments and faded ink writings. For several weeks, he had been obsessively searching for old maps and land registers. His goal was to find the land his great-great-grandfather had allegedly once owned. According to family legend, it was deep in the Appalachian mountains on the ruins of a village that had disappeared from the maps. Finally, he found a document that looked like what he was looking for. A hand-drawn deed dated 1887. A settlement called Havenwood was marked on it. But no such village existed on any modern map. Countless searches on the internet were also fruitless. It was as if Havenwood had never existed. This only fueled Elias' curiosity even more. The spirit of a historian and an adventurer drove him to solve the mystery of this lost village. The next morning, Elias packed his old Jeep. He took his camping gear, some maps, and the compass he inherited from his great-great-grandfather. He had also packed an old walkie-talkie in case his cell phone didn't work. The weather was cool and sunny. Getting away from the noise of city life and traveling deep into the forest gave him peace. After days of traveling over rough roads, he reached a point close to the geographical landmarks described in the title deed. The forest was even denser here, with trees almost completely blocking the sky. The GPS device kept losing signal. Elias had to rely on his old compass. The path became indistinct. After parking his Jeep in a suitable spot, he started walking on foot. No sound could be heard except the rustling of dried leaves and birdsong beneath his feet. After a few hours of hard walking, fatigue was beginning to take hold of his body when he saw a faint trail through the trees. It was as if it was a long, forgotten path. When he followed the trail, he reached a small clearing deep in the forest. And there it was, Havenwood erased from maps, forgotten by time. The village bore the silence of abandonment and decay. The dilapidated houses, the ivy-covered stone walls, a rusty water well. Everything whispered that there had been life here years ago, but now only the howling of the wind and the rustling of the trees could be heard. Elias began to look around carefully. He walked through streets that might once have been bustling. Some houses had their doors ajar. Inside there was broken furniture, dusty books, and forgotten objects. It was as if people had suddenly disappeared. A faded photograph on the wall of one house caught his attention. On it stood a group of people dressed in clothes from the late 19th century. Some of their faces were familiar. They looked like his great-great-grandfather. On the back of the photograph, in faint handwriting, was written, "The People of Havenwood, 1885. As the sun began to set, Elias found the ruins of a large church in the center of the village. The wooden door was still in place. When he entered, he saw dusty pews, a broken altar, and religious figures still visible on the wall. On the floor, he found an old diary as if it had been dropped in a hurry. The pages of the diary were yellowed and worn. He began to read it carefully. The diary belonged to Isaiah Carter, the last priest of the village. The entries told of Havenwood's slow descent into darkness. First the animals fell ill, then the crops dried up. Then there was a strange unrest among the villagers. They turned against each other and fought constantly. Later in the diary, Reverend Carter spoke of a curse that had fallen upon the village. He wrote that they were suffering the wrath of an ancient being that lived in the depths of the forest and that they were being punished for it. In desperation, they prayed and sought help, but no one heard them. The last pages of the diary were scribbled and filled with meaningless words. It was clear that Reverend Carter had lost his sanity. A final note read, "Don't go out. He is watching us." Elias shuddered. Was this just a legend, or was Havenwood really a cursed place? As night fell, Elias built a fire in a corner of the church. He filled his stomach with the canned food he had brought with him. The darkness and silence of the forest was eerie. He kept getting the feeling that something was watching him. In the morning, Elias decided to leave the village. He started walking towards where his jeep was parked. But something was strange. It was as if the road he had traveled yesterday had disappeared. The trees had thickened, and the path had disappeared. His compass was strangely always pointing north, disorienting him. He started to panic. Over and over he tried to go in different directions, but each time he found himself back at the borders of the village. It was as if an invisible wall was trapping him. His cell phone still had no signal, and his radio made nothing but static. In desperation, he returned to the village. Maybe he could find a clue in Reverend Carter's diary. At the church, he started reading the diary again. He was looking for something about how to break the curse, but the diary was filled only with despair and fear. Days turned into weeks. Elias searched for food and water in abandoned houses. He was not very skilled at hunting, but he survived on whatever fruits and plants he could find. At night, he sat by the fire and watched the stars. His only companion was Reverend Carter's diary. The silence of the village was occasionally broken by strange noises, distant whispers, unintelligible murmurs. Elias couldn't tell if they were the product of his imagination or part of the village's curse. One day, as he wandered around the outskirts of the village, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A rusty iron stake stuck in the ground. On it were strange symbols written in an ancient language. Elias didn't know what they meant, but instinctively, he felt that it had something to do with a curse. Elias tried to pull the stake out, but he couldn't. It was as if it was nailed to the ground. For days, he walked around the stake, studying the symbols. Finally, he came across similar symbols in Reverend Carter's diary. On one page of the diary, Reverend Carter wrote that these symbols were part of a ritual to appease the old being. But the ritual was incomplete, and the entity was enraged. Elias thought that the way to break the curse would be to complete the ritual. But he didn't know how the ritual was done. That part of the diary was torn. In a moment of despair, he discovered the basement of the church. Down a narrow, dark staircase, he found a room full of dusty chests and shelves. Inside a chest, he found an old book. The pages were yellowed, but the writing was still legible. The book was from the early years of Havenwood and was written by the village's first priest. It described in detail the old presence and the ritual to appease it. The ritual had to be performed at a specific time, in a specific place, with specific items. The place mentioned in the book was an old altar outside the village. The objects were some relics that belonged to the founders of the village and were kept in the church. Elias had a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out of Havenwood. The altar described in the book was located about a kilometer outside the village, deep in the forest. After a difficult walk, Elias reached the altar. It was an old structure of moss-covered stones. He took with him the relics he had found in the church. They were an old silver cross, an embroidered cloth, and a wooden box with strange shapes on it. According to the time described in the book, he was to perform the ritual at midnight when the full moon was at its brightest. That night, Elias waited at the altar. The silence of the forest grew deeper. The full moon hung brightly in the sky. At exactly midnight, Elias began to follow the instructions in the book. First, he placed the silver cross on the altar. Then he spread the embroidered cloth and opened the wooden box. Inside was a withered flower and a few pieces of bone. They were thought to belong to the founders of the village. Elias began to read the ancient prayers in the book. As the words came out of his mouth, a strange energy could be felt in the forest. The wind suddenly picked up and the trees began to rustle. Vague shapes appeared in the sky, then disappeared. After finishing his prayers, Elias waited in silence for a moment. Slowly, the tension around him subsided. The wind died down, the sky became clearer. It was as if a weight had been lifted. In the morning, Elias returned to the village. Everything looked the same, but there was one difference. The gloomy atmosphere over the village seemed to have lifted. Elias started walking back to where his jeep was parked. This time the road was clear. His compass was working normally. As he walked through the forest, it was as if he was breathing freely for the first time in years. When he left Havenwood behind, he looked back. The lost village was sleeping quietly in the depths of the forest. Elias had survived this cursed place, but he would never forget Havenwood's secret and the days of fear he had lived through. Perhaps some secrets should be forgotten forever as they disappeared from maps.